who has been for 17 years, he tells me now, a luminary of the Historic Buildings Department of the National Trust. His first interest in this subject came through doing a thesis on Richard Turner, who, as you remember, was the designer of the great Palm House at Kew, and that has spread on to all forms of iron work in the garden. And on that subject, you are about to illuminate us. Edward Diestelkamp.
Thank you. Early 19th century writers on gardening and horticulture, such as Humphrey Repton and John Claudius Loudon, were very enthusiastic about the potential of iron and its introduction into gardens and also into public parks throughout the century was quite remarkable. By the turn of the century, Walter Macfarlane's Saracen Foundry in Glasgow and could sort of display these various works that they produced in their showroom to the north of the city center. And on the other screen, you can see from their catalog, their 7th edition, a sort of idealized entrance to a public park with gates, lamps, and also a rather wonderful sort of iron bandstand in the background. One feature of the material which both Repton and Loudon praised was the great strength of iron in relation to the size of member when compared with other materials such as wood or stone. An iron scantling could be much slighter than its equivalent in these other materials, and so had a certain lightness of effect, which was particularly suitable to the Regency taste for eclectic styles. This lightness of effect was particularly appropriate to the world of the garden, which was primarily concerned with buildings and features in a landscape, rather than architecture or indeed engineering structures. So structures such as railings, on the left is the railings by Pinnathorn at Bonner Hall Gates in Victoria Park, and on the right, the railings around Worcester Square in New Haven, about the same date, mid-1840s. On the left here, Stanley Park, the railings of the 1870s, and on the right, turn of the century, very fine, very thin wrought iron railings at Pavilion Gardens in Buxton. And it was really this lightness of effect that was so desirable for horticulturalists and writers on landscape. Also in gates, here's 2 examples by Pinnathorn, the Bonner Hall Gates, the great entrance to Victoria Park of the mid-40s, and also on the other screen, the gates to Prince's Park in Liverpool, again mid-40s by Pinnathorn. But not only railings, but also conservatories, which as the century progressed became a feature of many public parks. The one on this side, Stanley Park in Liverpool, of about 1899 by Mackenzie and Moncur, and on the far screen, the conservatory in Hesketh Park in Southport, which was moved to the park in 1878 from a local residence. Bandstands, on the left here, the bandstand at Victoria Park in Southport by the Lion Foundry, and on the far screen, the music stand in St. Louis, Missouri by Eugene Greenleaf of 1872. Pavilions, the pagoda, formerly in Victoria Park, situated on island, which was erected there in 1847, but earlier had been the entrance to the Chinese exhibition in Hyde Park, 1841 to 43. And also on the further screen, the shelter in Victoria Park at Stafford, 1904, by Walter Macfarlane. At a shelter in the Marine Gardens in Southport, and also a detail just showing the molded panel and its integral sort of arrangement with the columns that were cast to receive it and both the glazing above. And it's good to, I think at this point, to emphasize the fact that by this period, by the 1870s and 80s, there were iron foundries throughout the country and producing designs such as this that were ready to erect and to be shipped to gardens and public parks. A rather wonderful example in New York, the Ladies' Pavilion in Central Park, designed by Jacob Ray Mould in 1871. You can see the rather extraordinary detailing, and he was a very gifted Englishman who moved to the United States and worked with Calvert Vaux on Central Park. And public conveniences such as this at Stanley Park in Liverpool, again with these lovely molded panels. And you can see very carefully detailed. It's very much a sort of work of precision and modular sort of parts that fit together and can be adapted to different situations. Verandas, such as that on the front of the conservatory at Stanley Park, we've already seen. Railings. Iron benches, such as these in Victoria Park in Stafford. And also, on the further screen, Victoria Park in London, a view of the boating lake in the 1930s, showing the benches arranged under the great Elm Avenue. Water drinking fountains, such as McFarland's little fountain in Bristol on Clifton Green, and the fountain in Shaw Place, St. Louis, Missouri, 1880. Watering fountains, such as this one in Bridgeport, Connecticut, for animal, beast, and human. You can see the great trough to the front, and the small one for dogs at the ground level. And behind, the other one had a drinking cup for humans. And it was erected by the Society for the Protection of Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And so, you see an angel preventing a man beating the horse. And that's of the 1890s, late 90s, by Proton Brothers in New York. But also more amazing structures such as the flagpoles in Bethesda Terrace, Central Park of 1860s. Again, Calvert Vaux and Jacob Ray Mould, extraordinary detailing. Lampposts in the Pavilion Gardens at Buxton by McDowell, Stephen and Company of Glasgow and London, about the turn of the century. And this rather wonderful watering trough on Cherry Hill in Central Park. Again, Jacob Ray Mould, a wonderful combination of water and gaslight, where you could draw your carriage up to the top of a hill, get a lovely view out across the park. Your horses could be watered, and you could do it in the moonlight as well. Bridges, the cast iron bridge in the Pavilion Gardens at Buxton by H. Bailey and Son of Manchester, and the lovely suspension bridge in Victoria Park, London, now lost, destroyed in the, well, taken down in the before the war. And even more extraordinary applications of iron, in this sense hidden but very integral and very important. The wonderful arcade in Central Park by Vaux and again by Mould, which is this underground subterranean passage beneath the road. And the road itself is supported on great cast iron beams, and from the beams are suspended enormous wrought iron plates. And then attached to these plates, each plate has about 350, 360 the most amazing Minton tiles. And these are all held in place by iron trellis that's sort of riveted directly into the iron plates. You can see two panels that have been restored and that is the next big campaign for Bethesda Terrace. But even smaller shelters, such as these in Hesketh Park, which were integral sort of benches actually built in and fitted to the cast iron columns that supported the roof. And I think these two slides illustrate really what happened in the 1960s and the 1970s to so much of the ironwork in our public parks. It was not understood, and when repair was necessary, the easiest expedient was often adopted. You can see here two examples from Hesketh Park of exactly the same structure, and one's been adapted with these aggregate plywood panels and felt roof, while the other still survives in a very sort of forlorn state, its timber seating having been removed. But it's really this insensitivity and lack of understanding of just how important these structures are to public parks and to gardens. In the same period, because of the changing role of public parks from the 19th century through our century, so many different uses of public parks have come about, and it's really introduced new requirements such as vehicular access. These two examples in Victoria Park, I think, illustrate very well the sort of degradation of really understanding how important iron is to the overall appreciation of a park. You have on the left a sort of vehicular roadway with just simple scaffolding tubing and held together with scaffolding clamps. On the right side, you have, you probably know there is a small railway at the Pavilion Gardens. And obviously that had to carry, a bridge had to be erected which could actually support the weight. And so a concrete deck platform was built. And the balustrade actually is composed of parts of an older bridge that have been sort of dismantled and reused, but in a very ad hoc and unhappy way. Certainly for Victoria Park, the real challenge, as in so many cases, came in the 1980s when Overup and partners proposed for the government that Victoria Park should be covered by a road. And quite rightly, the local residents were completely up in arms. They'd seen their park despoiled over the years and misused and mishandled. And really the great storm, when sort of over 300 trees were lost, was almost a blow from which they thought, you know, would the park recover? And then, on top of that, the government wants to build a road across it. But the actual sort of loss of so much of our, really the ability to control the security and the supervision of our parks came about because of the loss of railings. And they, as you know, were swept away as part of the war effort to provide scrap iron for the war effort. On the far screen, you see a view of the Bonner Hall gates in 1845, when they're newly opened, with the gates designed by Pinnathorn, and they were taken away in the war effort, and they've been restored in 1990 with the aid of a grant from English Heritage and an enormous sort of restoration program that was launched and has been ongoing from the late 80s, 89, right until 92, 93. You'll see that the balustrade to the bridge, which is immediately adjacent to the gates, wasn't taken away for security reasons. But fortunately, the drawings survive in the Greater London Record Office. And so there is a great deal of evidence that can be obtained through old photographs, old postcards, indeed even original drawings. And they're there to be used and to be looked at. These were restored by by Julian Harrop in 1991. But a more difficult problem, of course, is the security of certain important structures in parks, such as the important Burdett Coutts Fountain in Victoria Park, which was erected in 1862 and christened the Victoria Fountain in honor of the Queen. And designed by H.A. Derbyshire. It was celebrated in the architectural journals of the day for its wonderful use of materials. Beautiful colored stones, tiles, great lead work, lavish sculpture. And by the 1980s, it was sadly defaced. And it needed serious protection. English Heritage undertook an important restoration program, repaired the stonework, and it then needed, in some way, to be kept secure. So railings were erected around it on a plinth that formerly actually held decorative vases and urns and steps. So it has been a sort of introduction of railings where there formerly were none. You see in the far screen that simple, light, wrought iron fencing was formerly surrounded the fountain, but for the war effort it was removed, and so the building was completely unprotected. I think the final effect of the railings is somewhat discordant with the actual period and style of the fountain. And I think, you know, the Gothic that's been adopted is really a Gothic of an earlier decade, maybe 3 decades before, and it might have been possible to approximate more closely, but I don't really want to split hairs because I think it's doing a good job, but at the same time I think it's a real challenge to try and liberate these structures again for all of us in some way, and it really poses the problem of, you know, the actual management of our public parks in the future, and really a more widespread general appreciation and understanding of how important these structures are. But as part of the restoration program, benches were recast. There were some surviving ones, and also lamp standards were replaced. Again, an important security element for public parks today. The bandstand, which had disappeared also as part of the war effort, designed by Pinnathorn in 1875, was rebuilt by RMJM, and I feel its replacement is somewhat unhappy and doesn't have the same clarity and simplicity of the original structure. And I think that's something important to remember, that all the buildings in our public parks weren't fanciful and highly decorative. Some of them were functional, and some of them actually did a job without a great statement and without a great splash. And I think it's important to distinguish when that's appropriate. But railings such as these in this old photograph show the sort of park railing, this one 4-bar, and I think they were far more extensive than we now recognize, perhaps through our public parks. There certainly appear in old slides and old postcards, and are a reminder that the park railing we know in our country estates also had a place in town. But around lodges, this is the Morpeth Lodge at Victoria Park, still there are short sections of wrought iron railing with little feathered spearheads that do survive. And in front of Molesworth Lodge, there are over 3 different types of these similar types of railings that obviously have been moved from different parts of the park to be reassembled in front of this lodge of, I'm guessing, the 1840s, 1850s. But even more post-war, more railings were added along the night walk, and so they sort of, I think, look back to railings of 1930s design. More recently, and the 1 O'Clock Club, a play area for children of the 1970s, a pavilion built by the Greater London Council with railings of the period, and also on the farther screen, railings around the bowling green that was renewed about the same time. And I think these slides illustrate that many of our parks contain railings of different periods. And in a way, they're important to particular areas. And I think it would be, I think, wrong to assume that a general sort of clean slate would be the sort of basis from which we should work when looking at restoration or replacement. And instead that we really should work, first of all, from analysis and then definition of character areas for our parks. And that our railings should reflect the buildings, the planting, and that perhaps within the overall scheme of things, there derives from that a certain coherence and relationship that speaks of a certain integrity. I think the slides, I just wanted to point out the sort of slight hiccups you can get by a blanket approach to perhaps reproducing the same chair and using it, same bench, around the park when it's placed against railings of an obviously very different period. As part of the great program at Victoria Park, new gates were restored to, let's see, this is these are crown gates. And I think the railings and the gates themselves actually, well, they betray a certain lack of understanding in the design of ironwork, and a certain use of decorative motifs to sort of achieve design elements that really aren't historical. I think if you look in particular at the overthrows over the gates, they're in fact brackets that have been laid on their sides. And there is so much information in the form of books and treatises on the design of ironwork in our libraries and architectural archives that really are there to be used. This is Morpeth Lodge. Again, one of these new gates, and I feel that in a way, you know, the sort of classical turn of the century, this grand classical idiom adopted for the gateposts, is somewhat at variance with the lodge behind. And that's not to say that if, you know, there's not a place for new design. But I think at the same time, if the designer is fully aware of the context within which he's working, there might have been a slightly different solution. I think it's rather also interesting that the gates at Victoria Lodge, at Victoria Park, were mostly wooden. Due to the high cost of the Bonner Hall gates that Pinnathorn installed in the mid-40s, it was decided to adopt wooden gates throughout. And really, I think wood is the other material that maybe we should think about for railings and for gates. Wood was widely used around our parks, palings, fences, and it does add a certain rustic character that somehow might marry up better and make that transition between architecture and landscape, rather than more pompous statements that might not be appropriate. Moving to Battersea Park, again, as mentioned yesterday, the subtropical garden, which opened in 1863, and here you see the railings, the park railings, and also around the animal enclosure of the 1880s, 1890s, 8-bar sort of park railings. The Central Avenue, again, sorry, I'm not giving a great deal of background, but you'll know it's designed by Pinnathorn and follows close on the heels of Victoria Park. And the Central Avenue in Pinnathorn's second design was the main axes that cut across the park and actually provided a promenade connection between the east and the west. And that was planted with elms and had at its center this bandstand. That, with the railings and many other things lost through the decades, by the 1980s, a conservation plan was drawn up for Battersea Park, and that envisaged the restoration of this central bandstand feature, recognizing its importance at a major cross-axis in the park, this decorative element, and how better to do it than in iron, as it originally was done. I think it's rather fortunate that the illustration is shown on the conservation plan wasn't carried out. I mean, the railings themselves and also the sort of suggested form of the new bandstand. But I think, again, that the bandstand, as it was rebuilt at that time, is in a way, I wonder if it's trying to mix the idiom of the Festival of Britain pleasure grounds with the with this sort of Victorian bandstand that formerly was there. The lead roof, I think, is somewhat discordant with the idea of this cross axes of this major promenade avenue, the main feature, I think, of the Victorian Park. And again, I think the detailing of the balustrade is very free and speaks directly of the 1980s. And there are sources, if it's so wished, to be followed. These are the gates at Queen's Circle, which were added in 1901 to 2. Really rather wonderful sort of arts and crafts stone pedestrian gates with vehicular gates in the center. And new perimeter railings have been provided, and made of mild steel. They're extruded, and I think in the detail you can see that the edges are rounded. And you may feel it's splitting hairs again, but I think we should understand that the rolling techniques for wrought iron of the 19th century enabled iron to have perfect square corners. And I think if we're aware of that, perhaps when we're choosing materials with that in mind, we may seek out different sections. Around the lakes and the planting beds at Battersea are these wrought iron kick rails and railings that were such an important part of parks. And there are small sections that do survive. You can see they're slightly battered, but I think they're extremely fine. The lightness and the sort of wonderful way they've rusted down to an almost ground color. They are invisible in a way. And also on the southern perimeter drive, there are some sections of 19th century wrought iron railing on the left here, and then on the east perimeter drive, these very light sections of wrought iron railing that Edward Kemp praised so highly for their lightness of effect, and in fact, just the fact that they did disappear. And these have been used as models at Battersea, and very effectively to create new railings that are very, very sturdy and substantial. And I might suggest that perhaps the scantling, the thickness, is just a little bit too thick. But, you know, it is important that they do their job, and that also, in the longer term, maintenance is minimal. A view here of the pathway around the lake, and also the railings in front of the cascade. Old sort of reminiscences of the cascade and of the lake by visitors to the park record that at the turn of the century, the cascades were actually enclosed by higher fences. And so I think the risk, the security risk, has always been there, and fencing has been an important way to try and control that. Also introduced at Battersea are the now ubiquitous pointer signs that we see everywhere. And I mean, we find them in public parks, we find them on high streets, we find them in heritage sort of trails. And I feel that there is a place for this sort of thing, but we must, I think, be wary of trying to apply the same thing everywhere. And it appears also in Buxton, next to the lamp standard there. So, but at Buxton, the Pavilion Gardens, as laid out by Milne in the 1870s, were centered around this great iron frame structure, a refreshment place, to which was added this domed concert hall in the 1875, a few years later. More recently, with the help of a grant from the Heritage Lottery Fund, an overall program of some £4.5 million is being invested in Buxton. And this new bandstand was erected in 19 well, I think it might have been 1998, Derek Lovejoy bandstand, which its roof line echoes the sort of domed form of the concert hall, and in its overall elaboration of detail, it is, I think, very sympathetic with the pavilion and also the pavilion conservatory. But its detail, I feel, comes from a few decades later than the actual sort of 1880s, 1870s, and I mean, a more closer model would have been available. But also, I think the whole question of commemoration in this plaque, which in the 19th century was done so well, and it could be clearly seen, but not actually something you'd necessarily trip over or fall over, really is a challenge, because we do have to acknowledge the help that's being given to restore parks, gardens, buildings around the country. And I just think there are other ways. But the pavilion of the 1870s and the concert hall, with its ironwork, it's largely a wooden structure, but it does have the overall effect of something much lighter, iron and glass, due to the iron columns painted black, and also the iron crusting along its roof. It was ironwork provided by a firm from Liverpool. And in 1900, in 1903, the new Pavilion Conservatory and Frank Matcham's Opera House were added to the north side of the pavilion gardens. And the canopies, recently restored by Dorothea Restorations, just last year, actually do contribute a great deal, I feel, to the sort of opening out of these structures and the fact that they provide a sort of sheltering place, an entrance point to the Pavilion Conservatory. Another photograph showing the actual Pavilion Conservatory, which its sort of arrangement with the actual opera house was an important consideration at the time, and like ideas espoused by Repton and Loudon much earlier in the century, one might use a conservatory to actually mask a service building or an unattractive elevation. The Pavilion Conservatory does just that to the side of the opera house, so that the view from the park is in fact turned to a garden. The real challenge for so many parks is the interface between pedestrian and vehicle. And at the Pavilion Gardens, these bollards in a Regency sort of fluted Doric design are somewhat discordant with the actual period of its development and heyday and subsequent period. And I think there's a real need for guidance for people actually working on the ground that have to deal on a daily basis with the need to change arrangements for access by vehicles, and just simple statements that could be adopted, maybe even drawn up by the designer at the time of a big project, to which people responsible afterwards for maintenance and care could refer to, might be able to help give direction on style and source of details such as this, so you don't get these unhappy combinations. Safety also is an important element, and so much is done quickly on an ad hoc basis. Similar sort of direction might help to sort of explain the importance of achieving simple railings, but ones that really are sympathetic to the lie of the landscape and that don't form discordant angles and actually form harmonious sort of curvaceous lines in space. Simple statements are needed as reminders. As part of the overall restoration of the Pavilion Gardens, the boathouse has been rebuilt, and ironwork adjacent has been designed, and in a, I would say, very sympathetic turn-of-the-century manner. And at the same time, I would say it's actually very innovative and new in its design. And it's obviously not based on historical, directly on historical sources. There's something that's very creative about it. I feel it's a challenge, if we can rise to it, to actually be able to marry the two together. This is just an example of some railings that have gone in that have been, I mean, quite extraordinary tops that suggest a hand-wrought sort of finish, and yet the detail of the base is nicely let into sandstone curbs with good brackets behind, and this rather lovely sort of screen to protect people from falling into this pool at the end of the boating lake. The sort of curve, the sort of the concept of the line of the railing in space, floating through space and creating a line of design in its own right, is something that's so important for designers to appreciate and understand. It's not quite so difficult when you're dealing with a path such as this in a curb where you have a landform that you're creating to echo just that. It's more difficult if you take a railing across a green space where you have undulations that maybe sometimes you don't always wish to recognize. And so you have to adjust in height and also sometimes in its position from side to side where it will go, and slightly fudge it. But these new railings at Buxton really do create a beautiful line of design, I think. I think the farther slide I wanted to illustrate how important it might be to introduce railings today. You can see the sort of little pathway that's rutted into the hill there, and that's the result of mountain bikes. And it is important that I think our parks are places where we can enjoy certain areas of them, quiet walks and safety in a way from other activities that might involve skateboards and bicycles and things such as that. The off-the-peg catalog benches have been consistently sort of selected, very sympathetic, not identical, but sympathetic over the past decade for Buxton. And there aren't sort of obvious sort of changes in style. So again, maybe perhaps another thing that might be noted in a sort of guidance note that could be left following a big project such as this. But inevitably, we must recognize, I think, that public parks over time have become different, to mean different things to different people, and recreation, sports are something that parks in the mid-19th century didn't always cater for. And new design, such as this for a small basketball court, I think if it is, I actually think it's a rather good design, and if it stands well on its own and provides the sort of facility that's really needed, I think it's all how and where we place it often. Just going back to an example in New Haven, Connecticut, these railings that were added around the green in the 1840s were created around the green. And the real challenge more recently has been to provide bus shelters and lighting in a sympathetic way. And the new bus shelters you see, I think they derive very, very sort of directly from those shelters that we saw at Southport with the arched sort of iron glazing set into cast iron columns. And it's rather interesting that these lamp standards now appear all over the East Coast. I think there is, in a way, a need for more designs and more firms to do good historic designs as opposed to heritage sort of iron furniture that we see, I think, a bit too much of. Not so well sort of achieved at Springfield, Massachusetts, where I think, just some columns were purchased and sawn off, and some steel RSJ was welded together, and a bit of plastic roofing was landed on the top for both a new bus shelter and also, if you want to call it a bandstand, but I'm not too sure. But and also again, the same firm that produced the lamps in New Haven produced these rather good replicas. But they've in effect become sort of signposts for no parking, disabled parking signs. And I feel there's another way to achieve that. And also the spacing of these lamps is more like sort of parking meters in a way, I think. On the far screen, some benches, again reproduction, and made by a firm in Connecticut. And they're identical ones that formerly were used in Central Park. There is certainly a place for careful restoration in all of our parks. This example of the main gates in St. Louis in Tower Grove Park, designed in the 1880s by George Barnett, an Englishman who traveled to the States and created this garden for another Englishman who immigrated from Sheffield and made a great fortune in importing ironwork, of all things. But this great public park survives today due largely to the sort of quality of the design. And recently, a restoration project has restored these gates and also these wonderful railings. And it is so important that we get really, really good firms to do this type of work, because it's where, ironwork and stonework form an architectural composition that detail is absolutely crucial and vital. In front of the superintendent's house at Tower Grove Park, it was built in the 1860s, again by Barnett. Like so many of the London parks, dating sort of from Nash's time on, proposals for houses to encircle a park that then could be developed to help pay for the park itself. This was Shaw's idea. He's looking directly at England and using these ideas in St. Louis. But at the end of the day, only one house was built, and it actually was the first superintendent's house. And that superintendent was James Gurney, who moved from Kew Gardens to go and help Shaw actually lay out the garden there. And recently, these railings of the 1870s have been restored. At Central Park, so badly degraded over the 1970s and the 80s, a great program began in the early 80s. And one of the hearts of the actual park, at the top of the mall, the sort of concert music area around the band shell. This wisteria terrace overlooking the band shell was restored at that time, and it contains seats. I'm sorry I don't have a photograph, but seats that are identical to those that we saw at Springfield, Mass. And these railings were actually based very closely on Calvert Vaux's original designs for railings. They're quite extraordinary. I mean, I don't think there's anything anywhere quite like them. Wonderful cast iron stanchions supporting these great sections of timber with decorative wood sort of carved and then colored. And it's rather interesting that in the 80s, this whole area in front of the band shell was this complete sea of tarmac, and all of this detail had been lost. And that was reclaimed by creating planting beds, quite large, substantial, 4 of them, to break up this sea of gray. And Vaux's drawings were adapted to encircle these green areas, and really now are one of the main features of this. And these new urns were also added at that time. I think the scale and also the material and the coloring is absolutely appropriate, but somehow in the form it doesn't achieve the inventiveness and the creativeness that Vaux and Mold in particular lavished so carefully on all the other sort of objects at Central Park. And I think this understanding of the designer's sort of intent and also its particular standing in the broader context, comparing it with other parks, is important when we go to restore or to indeed intervene and add new things to something that's already there. Rather magnificent Bow Bridge of 1862, again a joint initiative by Calvert Vaux and Jacob Mold, restored and repainted its original colors, but sadly lacking the wonderful vases that stood on top of the piers, bracketed, ornamented, like an amazing jewel, really. And they had agaves and plants coming out of them and added something so special to the bridge. And undoubtedly, it is a question of security that one has to be sort of so conscious of. And it's really with that I just think it's important to recognize that iron does have an important function in our parks. It can add a wonderful cohesiveness to the whole. It certainly isn't meant to be the dominant thing, but if it's well thought out and if it's drawn together in a way that sort of reflects the importance of the place, then it can add just that little thread that helps knit things together. It has these functional purposes, and we must take these on board, health and safety and security. And that's going to mean careful analyses in the first stage before we set about designing. Thank you.
Ed, thank you very much. Certainly, personally, I can say that you have completely opened my eyes to things to which they've been far too long shut. And I think you've contributed a very important aspect of garden restoration, which we all need to be very aware of. So thank you. Now, Stephen, I know you're about. I think you're popping your things on the slide. I don't suppose that any of us are unaware of Stephen Anderton, because he peers out at us from a large number of newspapers. He is now, having been with English Heritage, is now a freelance author, of which we are thoroughly aware, and one of the most lively minds, I would say, working in the conservation department. So, Stephen, give us of your usual splendid excitement.
Thank you. I'll just sort my buttons first. Right. That's forward. Yeah, thank you. Good morning. I was very pleased to be asked to talk today about maintenance style, because it's something which exercised me a great deal when I was working in conservation. It's nice to feel that Ted feels I still do, because I do like talking about it in print, and sometimes it's a bit frustrating being so thoroughly out of it. Can you see that? I want to leave you looking at this heavily but slowly maintained landscape while I tell you a story at the beginning. One of the projects I worked on for English Heritage was Broadsworth Hall in Yorkshire, which was an 1860s house which had been lived in by its last owner without going out. She lived upstairs, and so did the dogs, and never went out. And there was a great long corridor that was the dog's toilet. And there was a stage during the restoration where in the beetle life under this carpet, a beetle of such rarity was discovered that it threatened to hold up the entire conservation program. But you imagine that thickness of beetles, you know, it's squelched. You imagine that under the wallpaper as well, and under the ceiling, because that's what happens outside in the garden. Things grow, you know, spaces. You can't really equate maintenance style indoors with maintenance style outdoors. The aim at Broadsworth was to go back to something as found, showing somewhere that was gently decayed and just about hanging on, and by a very scrapey, scratchy sort of approach, it was able to put that back. And we simply could not do that outside. There's need for a huge amount of vicious maintenance in order to get back to the thing itself, to get back to the scale of the intended artifact, and then maintain it in that style. The ongoing maintenance is a very separate thing. But all maintenance is interference. And I think this is the way we should look at maintenance. You know, you hear from everybody that gardens don't stand still and all that business, but can I just nail that expression slightly more by saying that what we mustn't do is look at them as would-be finished things, or things that we have to keep adjusting back to that perfect picture. I think the way we have to look at it is that in order to keep it there at all, there are whole cycles of interference that we just have to keep going on with, and nibbling away at or hacking at. And all those things, whether they're to do with handling the plants, or handling the hard landscape, or handling how we present it to visitors, all those things are maintenance. And they're all read by the visitors. And I think this is the most significant point about maintenance. We tend to think that we do the worrying as conservators, that, you know, we worry about getting it right and worrying about presenting it properly, and then people go through and somehow just see it as a nice finished thing and get that intended impression as a sealed unit. And they don't. They absorb all these nuances of the maintenance. They may not be aware of it, but they do. And we need to, when we think about maintenance and how we want to maintain, we have to not think about exclusively about what we think is right and wrong according to our motives of historicity. We also have to think about how what we do is read and how it makes its effect on people. People's sensibilities change. I want to tell you a marvellous story, which is, I rather always hope will turn out to be apocryphal, and there's probably somebody here who can tell me whether it is or not. When Hampton Court was being restored, there was apparently, and forgive me if you are here, there was apparently a marvellous meeting at which there was concern about whether the turf strips should be cylinder mown because it would leave stripes, whereas in fact originally they'd been scythed. And then somebody said, yes, but when they'd been scythed, they were rolled, so it would have been striped. So they said, well, okay, well, maybe we could cylinder mow it. And then somebody said, yes, but would there be honest stripes? Does anybody know the answer? I would love to know. I mean, I just think it's wonderful. The point about Hampton Court, the way people take it in, is that there are so many lines. And bless us, we are almost immune to this sort of thing. You imagine going down the river to Hampton Court when it was new. And the river was, you know, a mess. Most of the world was a mess in those days, woolly edged. And to see something like that, so large and so full of straight lines, must have been absolutely astonishing. We see more lines than that in Tesco's on Saturday, as big and as large and as writ large on the landscape. And so we can become immune not only to the physical reality of gardens, but to the effect they're intended to have. But we must always consider how people read gardens. And we have to consider what we want to say through our maintenance. Do we want it very hard and very fast? This is Nyman's, which, apart from the turf strips kept so magnificently clear of overlay, you might say as a, could be almost any time. And yet when you get in there and look at the rigid way those blocks are stacked in and staked and chunked together, it's magnificent. The amount of attention to practical detail there is astonishing. And that is how it makes its effect. People take that in. They take in the way that the work is piled on and crammed in there. That's how it gets its effect. Or alternatively, you may want a garden to seem extremely natural in the way it's maintained. Well, natural gives us great problems when it comes to maintenance style, because everybody thinks natural is low maintenance, and we know it isn't, I hope. The thing about natural is that to make something look natural, you are making your interference, which may be just as hard and just as often, show less. That's the crux of it. Some gardens, some so-called natural gardens, and a lot of the new modern German perennial gardens are really very, very high maintenance in many, many ways. And yet they get called natural. The work is still there and it shows, and that's what makes them work the way they do. So, sorry about the flare. What makes maintenance style work in certain circumstances? This is Broughton Hall near Skipton in Yorkshire. It's a Nesfield garden. And I looked around this a few years ago. They still have all Nesfield's watercolours in there for the original plans. And they have one old gardener who looks after this place on its own. This particular parterre had been cleared once and then replaced a few years ago, and it's fairly much out of scale compared to Nesfield's original work. But the turf work is all still the original Nesfield, and there are still bits of glass sitting amongst the gravel, coloured glass. And elsewhere in the park, the open spaces are still Nesfield's open spaces, and the big U globes are still Nesfield's U globes. Everything is immaculately maintained. And when we looked around this place, Mrs. Tempest wheeled out her old guy gardener, who was just like that bloke in the mower advert, with the trembly top lip when he thinks he's going to get the sack and all he gets is the new mower. And she asked Bert, or whatever he was called, if there was anything particular in the garden he'd like us to see. And there was one bed out the back of the house with half a dozen 6-foot yellow floribundas in it. And Bert said, considered this very hard and said, well, the floribundas are very nice. And it broke my heart, because that guy was doing a fantastic job. He was maintaining what mattered in that garden. And somebody with the money and the push could have gone in there tomorrow and put the glitz back on the Nesfield and made it a really, really good, hard-working period garden. But he knew what mattered, and he was keeping the important things right. And in a funny sort of way, what you got was a very, very relaxed garden. It was exciting to see. according to George Clark, when he was looking after Stowe, way, way, way before the National Trust, he had great arguments about tree planting in the Elysian Fields at Stowe, because a lot of the old paintings, looking across from the Temple of English Worthies, whatever the date, seemed to show small trees in the middle of the open space. And there were 3 large conkers, was it there, at that stage, which he was very anxious to get out, because looking at the old pictures, he was convinced that what everybody had always wanted was to have small, fresh trees in that space. And he felt the interference was needed on a fairly regular stage, in terms of tree lifetimes, to keep that look, to keep that freshness in place. This is York Gate in Leeds. Hugely manic garden, where the maintenance really, really does show. Everything is dealt with in a very, very fine way. And you may love it or hate it, but this is wearing maintenance on its sleeve. And this is what gives that garden its character. Very, very personal, very, very quirky. Even those great pyramids, well, they're not. They're whatever they're called, triangular-based pyramids, so that you get this extra play of light and shade. Beth Chatto's garden in Essex. People think this is natural. It's not remotely natural. It's extremely high maintenance gardening. It may not be very weedy. She may have worked very hard to deal with that. But what you see here is a very, very tight, high labour, naturalistic sort of planting. And if you half close your eyes and stand there and replace the gravel with lawn and all those beds with conifers and heathers, you know, you're straight back to 1960s heather gardening. Another very, very tight, controlled, naturalistic style. But in this case, a woollier, softer look, but still very, very high maintenance. And people love that mixture. What they see there is all that attention to detail which they enjoy, which they want to take away and copy, but done in a naturalistic way. And what they see too in that garden is a marriage of what lives inside a garden and what lives on the outside. The sorts of plants that live in that part of the world improved and brought into a garden. And it suggests to people that things are less artificial, less highly maintained than they are. It's a nice trick, but it doesn't alter the fact that it's still a hugely highly maintained garden. And people are happy to close their eyes to that, because what they read is the naturalistic effect first. I'll move on from that. This is Dixter. Moor meadow gardening. It's fascinating how people go to Dixter, and because they see weeds from time to time, decide it's a shabby garden. It's a hugely high maintenance garden, yet again. But it has whole areas which are naturalistic, where the maintenance is done on a gradual basis, interfering very hard and very heavily when it's necessary. And in all these gardens we're looking at, the crunch is when you interfere. It's not that you interfere less to make things naturalistic. It's that the timing is different. You're choosing to make major carvings up of a garden and then live with the results for a time. And it's not that people see the results and think, isn't it a mess now? Wasn't it good before? It's that they appreciate the time scale in which you are working. And I do think that's terribly important. Your attitudes to maintenance show, people appreciate that. They don't just take away the immediate effect, they take away a long-term effect of how you're working too. This is Holme Priory in Northumberland, and nowhere more than with trees is the issue of how often you interfere apparent. This is an old ash tree leaning way, way over a gateway, and it's hugely attractive, of course it is. But you imagine the stage where that tree lurched originally, fell over. Somebody had to make the decision and say, doesn't matter. It can stay on its side because we are thinking sufficiently long term to live with that. And it's a very hard decision to make. Most of the effects we like in gardens which suggest great longevity are ones which have had a nightmare middle age, when somebody has had the nerve to say, think long term, think the way we want this garden to appear, the way, the atmosphere we want to create by having old things in it. And they've bitten the bullet and lived through that middle-aged tree on its side looking difficult. In a similar sort of way, when you go into gardens where there are specimen trees on lawns and a new little starter pack tree, 3-foot cedar beside of it, against the evil day, you know, it's madness. There is no need. You have to have the confidence to think long term and to think that if you put a little tree in there, what you are showing people, whether they stop to think about it or not, is that you have no confidence in your long-term planning. It's a bit pathetic, really, putting in piddling trees next to great cedars. But, you know, it happens a lot. And it's actually telling people that sticking to a conservation plan is more important than their enjoyment. Really, you know, it's a bit of a cheek. We should always think about how people read things and have confidence that we're going to be around long enough. I mean, the conservation movement is fairly new, really. And in terms of these very large, publicly owned groups of gardens we've got, there's a lot to learn in that quarter. When people see an old hornbeam like this, they take away several things from it. They take away the sheer attraction of its age, but they also take away, maybe without knowing it, the fact that they're looking at something which is showing generations upon generation upon generation of maintenance. And it's that ongoing maintenance, as much as anything, that makes this attractive. The idea that it's an old work tree, that it's been coppiced for a few hundred years probably. It's what sticks, it's what lingers in people's minds, even if it's not what first leaps to their thought. So, the most critical thing, I think, in the way we maintain gardens is planning the timing of what we do. Not the right and wrong of what we do, but the timing of it, and thinking about how that affects people, what it says about a garden, what it says about our attitudes to maintenance, and how we want it to appear to other people. And then there is the nitty-gritty itself of how a garden has its maintenance done, the craftsmanship of it, if you like. And these two make a great deal of impact upon people. Here you see Sutton Place, a neat box hedge, good roses grown behind it, and Rosemore. Well, you might say, you know, if you can't afford it, don't do it. But when people see edges ignored like that, edges which cannot work because the maintenance system doesn't allow them to keep up the sort of maintenance it cries out for. The maintenance stems putting the mulch on doesn't allow them to keep up with the sort of maintenance which requires to keep the paths free of bird-thrown mulch. When people see that, they think, you know, nobody cares. Civic gardening. And it's putting that right is a matter of the next step up of maintenance and installing something which will allow that maintenance to work, like the box hedge or whatever. Isn't that marvellous? This is Newstead Abbey. Great garden. Grim place these days. But, you know, where do you start with that? You can see what they're doing. They don't want to damage the stonework, so they've dug this great trench to keep machines away from it. I mean, the fact that all the balls have been smashed off already off the corners of the steps doesn't matter. And in fact, because the turf banks or beds or whatever was beside the steps has gone, you might as well walk around them anyway. You could probably break your neck if you tried to step up the steps there. But what you're seeing is a message of health and safety. And it simply doesn't work. It's an insult to people. It's saying, we care about legislation, but not about you, or about the look of the garden. It's a nonsense. And when people see real, detailed work, as in the vinery at Chatsworth, and they see those trunks almost as polished as, you know, if you go into an old byre where there have been cattle tied up with ropes through the winter and the uprights are polished where the metal rings or the ropes have worn on them. That's what these vine trunks look like, where they've been scraped every winter to keep the pests and diseases at bay. When people see that sort of work, it's a great thrill, and they know that they're seeing people's care. And that is a huge amount of the appeal of kitchen gardening, really. I know there's a productivity side too, and the enjoyment of things to eat, but I think a great deal of what people get out of kitchen gardening and revivals of is the sheer care for it. When you see topiary being cared for with spirit levels and lines, then you know you are in very safe hands indeed. And vacuum blowers to get the bits off. If you can't do it properly, then, and properly for you is a precise look, then maybe you have to change what you're working on. Same with compost. People love to see this because they know, they read it as hard work and a cared for garden. They don't read it as just compost. And even down to the simple craft skills of, I don't know, making a good seed bed, or the way shading like this is washed onto a greenhouse window. It's wonderful to see that artistry. Tells you you're in a cared for garden, and people take a great deal of comfort in that. People absorb their feelings of gardens through very much more than their eyes, and turf is one of those areas where people take a great deal in. I mean, I don't think we give enough credence to what people absorb from the way we handle turf. When it's too long, when it's uncared for, when it's supposedly natural, it very quickly looks silly. I mean, this is somebody's wildflower lawn, you know. Turf has to look functional, but beyond that, there are 1,000,001 things you can do with it. The way that little drive across the bridge here is maintained at Abbots Ripton tells you immediately that, yes, it's a track, but because traffic is light, we're looking at something which could have been in use for, you know, any number of hundreds of years, the bridge onwards, really. There is just enough wear and tear and lack of repair to that wear and tear to tell you a great deal about the way the garden is used. And it's very tempting to improve and improve and improve turf. But actually being able to, and here it's being scarified and pulled out by the barrow load, people take in a great deal through the soles of their feet, and actually walking on a crunchy, coarse old lawn is a pleasure in itself. One of the great things about Broadsworth Hall, now it's finished, is that a lot of the carpets were so shot at that they were completely newly made, and everybody is allowed to walk on them, and it's wonderful. And you realise what a marvellous bourgeois house it is. And were they all rolled back and you were walking on boards and plastic and teetering around the edge, you know, you would lose so much of the experience of that place. And in gardens we can do it, but we should stick to having the range of riches underfoot which you can get out of different kinds of grass, and not improve for the sake of correctitude or even historical accuracy. When you look at something like this, you see how an area which is rough grass and trees is being given a cared for look by mowing one simple path through it. It tells you that it's a quiet garden because it's a narrow path. It's really one person's path. If it were twice as wide, it would give you a different message immediately. And although this is a temporary path, you know, you could mow it differently in the same season, differently the next year. It's an ephemeral thing. Yet the way it's crafted and the way it's shaped tells you a great deal about how this garden is used and owned and what it feels like. That was Villa Noailles at Grass. This is the Van Zeeman House at Munich, where meadow grass has just been given this slightly shorter edge, just to hold it at bay. And it still has that marvellous soft look, but the maintenance has made that long grass more of a promise than a threat by just edging it in that discreet way, giving it one short strip so it isn't going to flop on the paths. It keeps the line, it keeps it crisp, and you get the best of both worlds. You get the softness of the long grass and the lines. Here at Wadston, under trees, several receding layers and lengths of grass with different things growing in them. Maybe you can't see that, that's a little bit light. But very, very careful work there, gradually trying to move back from formal lawn at the front edge through into wilder grass at the back. So there's the timing of what we do, and then there's the craftsmanship of what we do, And then there's the servicing of the garden, which I firmly believe is very much part of maintenance. I don't think really you can separate them, because the way you physically care for the plants, the way you look after them, is you maintaining that picture. And the way you sign it, the way you seat it, the way you do all these other things are also major parts of the way you present that picture, not least because seats and signage always goes in a focal position, and it can lead to some real problems. This is the charm that was Heligan. You know, you have to have a bit of confidence in these things. I don't think you can read that. It says, please do not climb on the mound as it is newly planted. And on the other side it says, warning, this water is 3 feet deep. This was a new garden, designed by Penelope Hobhouse at Walmer, and one has to have sufficient confidence to live with a certain amount of risk. I know it's difficult these days, but if signing there has to be, then it has to be out of the way. I think this sort of work is insulting, absolutely insulting to people, and gives ruins otherwise careful work. This is Harlow Car. Harlow Car, incidentally, before the Royal Horticultural Society owned it. Seating is one of the biggest letdowns in the maintenance of any garden. And it's not just getting the right seat, or the right railings you've been hearing about this morning. It's making things look right. I mean, if you're going to have a seat on sloping ground, then hey, level it up. It matters. It really, really matters. Look at it. You know, the person on the bottom end would keep having to move around and start again at the top. That is as much an insult to your public as leaving lines of lawn mowings on the grass. It really is. It shows you don't care. And I think it's hugely important in managing gardens that everybody on the team, down at the sharp end, is aware of what kind of maintenance style you want to show. And that philosophically, people are on board with how you want to present that garden to the public. Because, you know, 9 times 10, you're just getting on with the job, and that's fine. But cumulatively, if the whole presentational team of the place, gardeners and presentation staff, are really on board with that, and that is as high in their minds as sticking to 5-year plans and budgets and all the rest of it, then it'll be a very good thing. Look at that. Isn't that a bit more like it? Now that's high maintenance, hugely high maintenance, isn't it? It's a real contrivance. But it says, my God, it says relaxation. It says, you know, sleepy, comfortable, wonderful, been there forever, and yet it's hugely high maintenance. Somebody's been out nibbling there and tucking in the stems and really working very hard at it to give that apparently effortless impression. So I think those are the 3 things. Let me just wind up on that. It's the speed with which you interfere at all levels, the scale of your timing, so that on a largely arboreal garden, you choose a speed of interference which allows it to look either hard and fast, if that's the sort of arboreal garden you want, or a very gradual, easygoing, quiet one. Or in more mixed gardens, then you interfere at a whole range of levels to create the softness you want. And it's the managing of that craftsmanship. So it says speed, or so it says invisibility. We're not really there. and it's managing all the things which aren't quite gardening, but which, because you are sticking them in the picture, which is the garden, also have a very major effect. Thank you.
I think what he's taught us is the artist. We've got to have idea on our mind as to what we're trying to achieve and we're getting to our maintenance. And if we don't have that idea and if we don't do it properly, we muck it all up. So, Stephen, we'll try not to muck it all up. Thank you very much, and nice comment.